Good evening and welcome to the Kuhn Academy for this installment of AP US History, where we are not just learning history, we're making history. All right, today we're going to talk a little bit about the women's movement of the 1840s. All right, we should have done our reform party in class today, and tonight you're reading about a debate about kind of the status of women in society for a seminar discussion on Friday. Okay, so these notes are going to be pretty important to understanding the whole movement. Okay, the women's movement begins at a place called Seneca Falls, New York. All right, it's a town in upstate New York. Near Cooperstown, Syracuse, somewhere in that neighborhood. And as you can see in the picture there, I am on the corner where they held the first convention of women's rights, where they decided to draft something called a Declaration of Sentiments, similar to our Declaration of Independence. Okay, the convention was called for by a woman named Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. All right, and Lucretia Mott had actually been to Europe to discuss an anti-slavery convention over there, to talk about the abolitionist movement, and women were not allowed to sit with the men. They had to sit in the back, and she was very disgraced with how they were treated. So she came back to the States and talked to some of her friends, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and said, we need to do something about this. This is wrong for how women are treated. So in Seneca Falls, they issued a Women's Declaration of Independence, which is the same as a Declaration of Sentiments. Okay, and it basically paraphrases the Declaration. You should be reading this tonight as well, because we want to quote this in our discussion Friday. All right, it gave a list of grievances. All right, just like in the Declaration of Independence, it said he has ... and rattles off a series of grievances against men for how they've treated women, like limiting them from occupations, not letting them get an education, and so on. All right, and it also stated that all men and women were created equal. That's the big difference in the Declaration of Sentiments. Okay, they started holding subsequent conventions in 1850 to continue to push for the right to vote. All right, Susan B. Anthony is one of the younger members, but she kind of emerges out of that convention as the leading spokesperson, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Okay. There were some male reformers that were in support of this, but most were obviously opposed for various reasons. Most notably that if women got the right to vote, it was going to limit male suffrage, perhaps. Okay, here are some of the successes of the women's movement by 1860. 1860 is an important date because that is when our Civil War begins, kind of the end of antebellum America. Okay, so it's a turning point and a date we want to make sure we know, sort of a before and after. Okay, more women started finding employment in industry. Okay, industry was growing, especially in the North, needed workforce. Women found an avenue there. Okay, they were starting to get property in 12 states, mostly in the North. Okay, so they could inherit property from their husbands and own it on their own, but still not the right to vote. All right, a big push. I wish I had a picture to show you this, but there was a big push as far as women's clothing went, called the bloomer costume movement. All right, some of the cheerleaders might know what bloomers are. I don't really know. I'm not equipped to talk about this, but basically it was this notion that you had more loose-fitting clothing, because before then the corset was a big article of clothing women would wear to make them appear to be skinny. And what you do, if you've seen the movie Gone with the Wind, which is a historical classic, there's a scene in here where women, where Scarlett O'Hara, the main character, has to put a corset on, which basically squeezes her body so she looks super thin in the waistline, and then would wear the hoop skirts, which were basically had wooden bars in them to kind of fan out a little bit, kind of like so, like there would be your skirt that way, okay, and then your woman, it's a bad stick figure, I know, but the corset would basically squeeze your body and actually start damaging your internal organs. You're pressing everything together, digestive system not flowing well, and things like that. So they pushed for a more comfortable clothing, more loose fitting, called the bloomer costume, so they could start to have some comfort. They felt that was appropriate instead of these rules of society, like where they could not expose their elbows, they couldn't expose their knees, things like that. Okay, we'll see that trend pop up more and more throughout history. Started to see some schools be open to women. Okay, Oberlin College, the E should not be there. Okay, Oberlin College in Ohio was the first co-ed college. Mount Holyoke was the first all-women's college. Okay, Emma Willard was one of our Reform Party people. We didn't invite her because we could only invite 22, but she founded a seminary so women could get involved in religion. All right, and a few of the lower-paying professions were open to women: nursing, elementary school teaching. These are stereotypes that still exist with us today. Okay, but if you think about it, the nurse makes less money than the doctor. The elementary school teacher makes less money than your college professor, high school teacher, which tends to typically be male. So we're still fighting some of these stereotypes and pay discrepancies that existed even back then. All right. Mentioned a little bit the cult of domesticity in class. Okay, we talked about men going to work now, industry taking them away from their home. Okay, so the cult of domesticity was kind of redefining the home as the sphere for the woman. Okay, that's where she's going to be. She's going to be taking care of her children, keeping the house clean, and basically the term housewife kind of is invented here during the cult of domesticity. Okay, that became separate from working and making money, and that sort of became their calling, if you will. Okay, so the women got their fulfillment in life, where a man would go to work, have a job, make money, accomplish something. That was his source of fulfillment, and he would come home for refuge and relaxation, where the women got fulfillment through the self-sacrifice. I'm giving up for my kids, I'm giving up for my children, raising my family, etc. Okay, so the cult of domesticity is a sort of a term for women basically staying at home while the men went to work, if you will. Okay, we're going to pause right here and come back and pick up with the Lowell Mill girls when we return. So thanks for listening to the Kuhn Academy, where we are not just learning history, we're making history.